Welcome again to another edition of The Radical Imagination. I'm Michael Pelias, one of the co-hosts, today with another co-host, Peter Bratsis, to my left. And we have a special guest, Kristin Lawler, who is a professor at Mount St. Vincent College in the Bronx, and is also the author of a book, American Surfer, that has been out there for a number of years, and she is now working on a new book, Shanti Irish, which she will speak to today on our program as we move along. Today's topic is strategies of capital abandonment in afflicted cities and the possibility of working class insurrection or upsurge, if you will. You know, I like both terms. Maybe we can talk about the difference between the two terms and whether or not there's a possibility. We have in mind two cities and possibly a few more. One city, of course, is Detroit. And we were going to be joined by Dan Yuriakas today, the author of Detroit, I Do Mind Dying. And I'm going to put up the book. Maybe we can get a shot of this. Detroit, I Do Mind Dying, a classic work from the late 90s that is now in multiple editions.
From the
middle 70s it was conceived, right? And then republished with an appendix, right? And co-authored with Marvin Serkin, who actually works at LIU Brooklyn with me in the urban department, urban studies department. So anyway, we will speak about this book as well. First, I want to mention, it's over with, but the Left Forum had a great weekend, and we were on a panel on this very issue, so we're going to kind of speak once again about what we spoke about and will be speaking about in the future. I also want to mention that we have a forthcoming issue of Situations, project of the Radical Imagination, of which all three of us are members of the collective. And we all have pieces in it, but we do have an interview with Dan at the beginning of this issue entitled On the Mediterranean Imaginary. His is called From Detroit to Athens and Back, the interview. And it was an interview conducted by Peter, myself, and Kristin in, New Haven, Connecticut. We spent a long afternoon with Dan and spoke to him both about the book and the possibility of what's going on today's, possible revolutionary insurrections or upsurges. Dan's classic comment, and I really wish he was here to elaborate more about this, is the left is too soft.
Yeah.
So period. And we might address that as well. So I would like to begin, as most people probably in our audience and our viewers know, there's a concept out there called disaster capitalism that was sort of coined, but was certainly in the literature before Naomi Klein, even though she coined it in a book called The Shock Doctrine, in which disaster capitalism is defined as a capitalism that really acts as predatory vultures after either a natural disaster or a man-made disaster. And I had the experience of witnessing this firsthand in terms of the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, how the city was reconfigured in terms of the ideal, the blueprint for the future of the city, what neighborhoods were left behind, how certain areas, became a new form of what I will call boutique capitalism in the program, and we can discuss that as well. And also the city of Detroit, which, as we know, has been abandoned by man-made disasters, and of course the closing of the General Motors plants, the closing of factories in Flint, Michigan, and we all know the problem in Flint, Michigan today. In my opinion, the governor should be, there's not a jail large enough to hold him and his cronies of what they allowed to happen, which seems to me be a symptom of disaster capitalism that we can talk about. But first, I'm going to open it up to Kristin, who is on the board of Left Forum, maybe talk a little bit about Left Forum and the events, and as well maybe speak to her new book, and then we'll transition back to the topic for today on strategies of capital abandonment.
Okay,
So
thank you,
take it,
Michael.
please.
Well,
Yep.
by the time you viewers see this, the left forum will be over. But for us right now, it hasn't happened yet. So we're sort of an interesting temporality, I guess, of this, what's happening between us and you right now. But anyway, the left forum is going to be off the hook this year, and hopefully by the time you see it, it will have already been. We have fantastic speakers. The three of us have put together a panel with Dan Georgakis and Diane Feely on Detroit, Greece, and capital abandonment, which again, we have an interview and situations that we did with Dan really on this idea. And yeah, I'd like to dig into that as we move forward in the hour, because it's really, what I find in my own work is that everything I think is cool, everything I think is so radical and the most interesting thing, when I go down that road, I find Dan Georgakis there. So whether we're talking about the IWW, which is part of what I'm looking at, these Shanti Irish folks are from 100 years ago, or Black Mask, Up Against the Wall, motherfucker, stuff in, around Greek Americans, Detroit kinds of issues. I'm very partial to that kind of anarchist, syndicalist, maybe. I don't know if that's how he would characterize himself. But that orientation, that direct action orientation, the orientation around the materiality of culture and cultural acts, like theater and art, as actually real interventions.
Yes.
I've become very, so much of what's going to be happening at the Left Forum is people talking about Bernie Sanders and this sort of massive upsurge in left politics, of which I think Bernie Sanders is only the most recent kind of moment. There's a lot of direct action going on right now in terms of climate stuff, in terms of even museums, these like not an alternative people. And I always see the beginning of this kind of arc of struggle as Seattle in 1999, or that's sort of when it really came to my attention in the beginning. And billionaires for Bush and the yes men, people who were sort of saboteurs of mass media and really engaging in kind
Reverend Billy.
Yeah, all that stuff. All that stuff.
Yeah, right,
Yeah,
exactly.
and so I think we've seen, and then obviously Occupy is part of that. When Occupy was happening, everybody said, "What are your demands? What are your demands? What are your demands?" And then, 5 years later, we've got to listen to a speech of Bernie Sanders. That's a start. That's where people are, sort of beginning to say where our demands are. The social democratic, stuff we should have had a long time ago. But yeah, so one of the things that everybody's doing at Left Forum is saying, how do we kind of ride this wave? There's definitely a wave. I like the surf analogy, the surf metaphor, obviously. But how do we?
And also brain waves as well.
Right.
How do we ride both waves?
Right.
Yes,
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely, materially, yes.
And people are talking about what are the forms of organization that are best for, for making a revolution, for, what we want to happen and what we want to come out of this long arc of struggle that includes Black Lives Matter, obviously, also, which I think has a different kind of an origin. And so looking back at some of the, in looking at Detroit, I Do Mind Dying Again, and looking at the way that people were really at that time, that the League of, and the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement and the other RUMs around, what they were doing to have these same kinds of conversations about how best to organize and making interventions on the streets and Black Mask and Up Against the Wall and stuff like that. The last thing I'll just say about Dan, and then we could talk some more about the Left Forum as a whole, is that, because I've been looking at the Irish Americans from 100 years ago and the IWW, a lot of sabotage stuff during World War I, coal miners, starting with the Molly Maguires in the anthracite coal regions of Pennsylvania. The Easter Rising was 100 years ago, like practically today. And I've become very taken with this idea, and one that I think the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement and Black Mask and other things that Dan has been involved with sort of resonate with that type of politics, which is also that if you want to change sort of consciousness, if you want to make a real cultural change, there's almost nothing we always underestimate, I feel like, when we sit around saying, how do we organize? What's the best kind of mass mobilization organization that we can have, blah, blah, blah. We underestimate how powerful an act is, an action, you know, in unleashing people's imaginations of what's possible, in really transforming. You don't have to necessarily like transform everything in order to act in such a way that is really transformative and that has unpredictable kinds of effects. So, so this is kind of what I want my intervention in the Left Forum to be. I think it's incredibly important this year, almost more than a lot of other years. And you can see people are flocking to the Left Forum. There's a lot of talk about what's going to happen because people want to work this stuff out. You know, what do we do? This is actually, I mean, I came of age politically in the 1980s where it was like, you know, I mean, it was freaking
CBVGs.
horrible. Well, okay, yeah,
Yes,
culturally,
right.
if you lived in New
Culturally,
York
yeah.
and you were a punk rocker,
Right,
maybe it wasn't
right,
that bad.
right.
But if you were growing up in
Right,
Philly
sure,
under, you know,
sure.
like the
Rocky 2
yeah.
and Rocky 3. Yes.
That was another good thing. Okay, so you're bringing up the good things.
Sorry.
Rocky 2. I was in Rocky 2. I
Yes.
was one of the kids
Okay.
running behind Rocky.
Cool,
Did you know that?
Yeah, I
That's
did
like
not
my,
know that.
oh my
That's
God,
a
that's
very
like my
good thing.
proudest.
Yes, yeah.
I'm one
I
of
see it
those
in the
children.
credits now.
Oh,
We'll
yeah.
have to add it today.
That's one of my proudest moments in life. Absolutely.
Maybe Peter could just, when you spoke about an act, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
kind of instigating something, maybe Peter could bring this back to Greece in a neighborhood that I'm very fond of in Athens, and how this maybe instigated some kind of new political, at least, upsurge in Greece, right?
You
the
mean
killing
what
of
happened in
yeah,
Exarchia?
Yeah.
Yeah, in Exarchia.
Well, it triggered an uprising in
Yes.
December of 2002.
yeah.
But it,
eight,
but,
right?
2008, I'm
Eight,
sorry,
yeah.
in 2008. But it didn't really lead to more,
Yes.
I think, than that. In the same way that a few weeks ago, we compared the uprising in Baltimore in last year to what happened in Athens. And in Baltimore, I noted they burned down some like 20 buildings.
Right.
In Athens, they had, in Greece as a whole, not just in Athens,
Right.
it was close to 800 buildings
Right.
that were torched. In Detroit,
No, it's not many.
in 1967, in July of 67, it was over 2,500
Right.
buildings.
Right.
It was the
Yes.
largest
Some still
destruction.
there.
Yes, of course.
Slightly
It
standing.
was the largest
Oh, yeah.
destruction
Yes.
of loss of property up until Katrina in the United States.
Right.
That was the largest. So it was not
Wow.
insignificant.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things, I think, in the interview with Dan is his analysis that pegs the decline of Detroit, the capital abandonment of Detroit, not to 67, because I think many people thought once you had the rise of Drum, which Drum had the first wildcat strike, or the first strike in Dodge, and I think at that
Right.
point it was about 14 years, happened in September of 1967,
Right
when
after.
thousands of black auto workers, it was about 6,000 people, walked out because someone got fired unjustly.
Right. It's
Which,
an amazing story.
From the
Yes.
contemporary standpoint,
Amazing.
it would be it's very hard to
think about
yes,
this,
to
right,
contemplate
right.
that 5,000
Right.
people
Yeah.
would walk out,
Out for
risk
one.
their jobs
For
for
one.
one person who they thought was
They probably
unjustly
wouldn't walk
fired.
out today for 500.
Probably.
For 1,000. I'm going to protect
Probably.
my own. But anyway.
Probably. But Dan's argument in the interview is that it goes back to the 50s,
Yes.
and that the Studebaker plant, which Studebaker went under, I think it was 1956 or 57, is still empty since then. It was not bought up in 1956,
Right.
which were boom years, certainly in the auto industry in Detroit, because already the plan was to leave Detroit, was to break
Right.
the union power that already existed in Detroit, to break up that concentration of activity
Right.
and move south.
Right.
So in some ways, it seems like events can be consequential, and obviously they can. At the same time, you see that the other side is not sitting idly by. They
No, of
have
course
already,
not.
of course,
Right.
Yeah.
their plans in motion,
Right.
which even from the standpoint of Drum, which who were very clever people, and they were able to do a lot, even from their standpoint was probably beyond their imagination at that point, that the auto industry could simply move,
Yeah.
could abandon the whole city and move, and that is
Right.
that is hard
Right.
to counter
Yes.
when
And
the,
that's-
when the other people control all the cash and all the buildings.
That's what's sort of so tragic, you know, about reading that story and about in the interview, Dan talking about this potential counter history. What if the UAW had said, oh, Watson, you took a Wayne State newspaper and made it into, and basically took it over and made it into Detroit's third largest daily newspaper. Why don't you take charge of the UAW paper? Or Ken Cockrell, you're a great lawyer. Why don't you, you know, I mean, the idea that they didn't see this, because the thing is, these guys, the drum guys and the league, did talk about automation, and they did talk about, and one thing I thought was so interesting, and sort of what was coming down the pike and how to activate leverage while you still have it and stuff like that. One thing I thought was so interesting that when I was looking at this yesterday, and I feel like I had missed this the first time, but maybe it's partly because I'm thinking so much about like land right now, is that in their demand for $500 million of reparations, many millions it was a demand for land in the South, which I thought, you know, was very interesting, you know. So I think they had some sense that, you know, where things were going. They certainly knew what time it was, way more than the UAW did, and it's tragic to see that, you know, what could have been. That sort of, you know, counter history is really intense. Because the UAW never imagined that their golf buddies were going to leave them automate, you know, all the jobs
Move
out
to
of
Tennessee
production.
and Kentucky
They're
and
like, but they're
Mississippi.
my friends, you know.
So you bring up, Kristin, a very interesting starting point maybe for your new book. How do you write a counter history? Maybe you could talk a little bit about what we're going to expect from the Shanti
Well,
Irish.
the way that I started doing this project was sort of roundabout. I thought I was going to write a book this year. I'm on sabbatical, so I'm home every day just like working. And I thought I was going to write a book, my Slacker Politics book, which is sort of like a political argument and exhortation, you know, slow down as a means to gaining leverage over capital while you still have it. Because the other thing that Dan said, which is sort of so tragic, about when we asked about class struggle in Detroit right now, in the interview, he said, it's too late. It's done. It's over. They, you know, there was a moment, there was a possibility, and now there's not anymore, you know, unless you want to plant gardens like Grace Lee Boggs did and stuff like that. But, you know, other than that, not really. So anyway, you know, I wanted to make this case that, because now, which I love, all of these people are talking about, and young people, this is so great. I feel like this is a little bit of a, you know, a sort of legacy of Generation X or something. But there's all these young people who are like, fuck work. Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Okay, sorry. Who are really talking about more leisure and less work. And so I feel like that's so great. But a lot of people don't talk so much about how you actually make that happen, and the sort of point of production in the workplace and all over the place. So it's point of production and other stuff too, but sort of direct action at the moment that you hit up against capital and elites all the time. This sort of collective slowing down. As not just an end, but a means to an end of higher wages and leverage, and stuff like that. So I went back to the IWW because of the, you know, Mike Davis has that great article in Radical America, which of course Dan Georgakis was also part of that whole crew of the you know, Radical America group. And Mike Davis wrote this great thing called The Stopwatch and the Wooden Shoe. It was published in 1973 about the culture of sabotage of the IWW, and really laying it out as a culture of slowing down, a certain kind of militant slowing down as against like clock time. It was very E.P. Thompson-ish in a way, and really cool. So I was like, oh, I love the IWW. Let me go back and, you know, hallelujah, I'm a bum. I love that stuff. I've written about it a little bit before. And so I go back and I start reading like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and all these other people who are in the IWW, and they're writing about sabotage. And I start looking at it, and I'm reading it, and there's all these like pamphlets, and you know, Gurley Flynn is such an interesting character, but Irish girl. But you know, she sort of disavowed it all later, and I think partly because she became more involved in the hope of building something new in the Soviet Union than sort of sabotaging what was there. So I'm really interested in that line. Like I'm always more comfortable with resistance, and this is where the Irish thing comes in too, with national liberation struggles rather than nationalism, kind of nation building. But the line between that is sort of what I'm trying to kind of work out. But anyway, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, all these other folks, Big Bill Haywood, he was a little more straight out about what sabotage actually meant. But all these IWW folks are talking about, it's just the collective withdrawal of efficiency. It's not bombing anything. I'm sitting and reading this and going, I didn't say it was bombing anything. Who said it was bombing? So, so it's sort of a counter reading. You can't read anything straight, and so that led me to realize that there are these Irish minor and hobo kinds of roots of the IWW that are not, for some reason, the IWW is not part of the story of the history of the Irish in America. And the Irish are not really part of the story of the history of the IWW. And this amazes me because all I've been doing is reading history books where it's completely clear that that's what was going on. But people are very attached to this idea that the Irish were cool, and then they all became cops and assholes and racists, basically, and machine politicians and stuff like that. And I think there's more to the story. And so the other thing about sabotage is that a lot of this stuff is happening during World War I. So at the end of Mike Davis's article, and at the end of lots of labor historians who write about the IWW, they say, it's the most militant, greatest, badass thing that ever happened. And then the man came in and crushed it like an insect, and that was it. It was all over. And it was just because it was so great that it got smashed to the ground. And something about sort of sabotage and reading, some of I was like, let me see what do the bosses have to say? What does like the boss newspaper have to say? What does the government have to say about this? And they're, what they're actually saying, and then what you start to really find out when you investigate not just characters like James Connolly, who was back and forth between Ireland and the U.S., but Jim Larkin, who had been one of the big leaders of the 1913 dock workers' strike in Dublin, and which was one of the originators of this idea of Cuccanny, or I don't know if I'm saying it right, but it's slowing down on the docks, sabotage on the docks, and it spread to Scotland. Like people talk about the Scottish origins and the French origins of sabotage, but I've actually traced it kind of just to a dock kind of a thing, and a lot of Irish dock workers in the UK and also in the United States. So anyway, I'll just end this little point by saying the reason it got repressed was because they actually were sabotaging the war effort. I mean, these are Irish people. They're not going to touch, there were things called the munitions strikes. They're not building bombs that are going to help the British Empire. No way. You know what I mean? They're not touching cargo that's going to help the British Empire. Forget about it. And there's all this great stuff about Indian nationalists and black nationalists, Marcus Garvey, and all kinds of people with the sort of Fenian types, like the Irish nationalists.
And maybe indirectly it contributed to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know the line.
Take the thread from there in some ways.
I don't know if you can.
In terms of the slowdown of munitions building and transport, and the war having to.
It was a very popular idea, and this is what I mean. Like for me, when people talk about like, what should we do? How should we organize? I just always feel like, hands off the cargo. First thing is you don't touch it. Whatever it is that you don't like, you just, and of course it takes a lot of organizing, but it's a different kind of organizing than whatever. I saw this letter. Did you see this? It's like a letter from somebody. It's very well-intentioned and really cool, like a love letter to Bernie Sanders or something. Like, what's the next step in our relationship?
I missed that one.
Yeah,
I'm looking more forward to reading the ones to Trump. I think they'll be much more interesting.
Oh man! Well, talk about it's so funny. I'm talking about like surrealism
Freudians
too.
Here, we'd be more interested in the letters to Trump. But anyway.
Well, anyway, it's like people are asking for some kind of like a mailing list or something, and it just doesn't. you know, these little phones in our pockets connect us all together. We don't have to worry about any of that stuff anymore. You know, it's just like in the Communist Manifesto, it's the same thing. The transportation and communications infrastructure becomes what you use. They build it. You do sort of, you know, in a type of sabotage,
They
you
build
kind
the
of
weapons
take
which
it
will
out.
ultimately destroy them.
Absolutely.
To rephrase
Absolutely.
the
Yeah.
Manifesto of 1848.
Right.
Yes.
And
Okay.
it's, you know.
Good.
And Kristin, where does the title come from, Shanti Irish?
Oh, well, okay. The other thing that's been happening in this project, because I really didn't think I was doing this, but I just was like, you know what, I'm on sabbatical. Who knows when I'm ever going to get to do this again. I don't care about writing a book, but I am going to write this book. But I was like, I don't care about producing. I want to really follow. And so I started to be like, wait, is there a connection between this and this? And so like the hobos out in Chicago, especially, and out west, the migrant workers, Irish. And I mean, it's like, it's really striking to me. So I started looking at the hobos because I always loved them anyway. Like something about surfers, hobos, I don't know. There's a certain kind of a crowd that I sort of like, you know, and the hobos are even more militant, you know. I mean, they really, the idea of engaging in these.
The actor Robert Mitchum loved the hobos. He would jump trains to get out of Hollywood.
Really?
Just to hang, yes.
I did not
It's in
know
his
that.
biography.
See,
it's a
that's
very interesting
it's so-
moment of a great actor, in my opinion, who had real issues with the Hollywood authorities and bosses, and he wanted, when he needed to chill,
It's so good
he
to
would
know.
go to jump a train and hang out with the hobos.
Yeah.
So,
It's
very
freedom, you
Yeah,
know,
right.
it really is freedom.
Right.
And also it's power. I did this, I gave a paper last week actually at a conference in Nova Scotia talking about the hobos and the sort of how they were framed in like Chicago school kinds of ethnographies. And this is another thing that I read against the great, so it's not exactly a counter history, but it's sort of a counter reading. You can't read anything straight. So the Chicago school guys are going, isn't it so terrible? They're so, oh, look at this anomie, they're so lonely and it's so awful and they don't know each other. And it's like, because they go by nicknames, they're like Minnesota, whatever, and Denver
Right,
Slim
right,
and all
right.
this kind of stuff. And
Great
they're having,
names.
yeah,
Great
oh,
name, yeah.
fantastic. And they made up slang completely.
sure.
And a lot of that comes from Irish stuff too,
Sure.
which people don't, you know, sort of always talk about. So anyway, I got interested in these guys, especially this free speech battles and the, you know, in the IWW papers, the call would go out, calling all footloose rebels to come fill the jails when guys were getting arrested and people were getting arrested for soapbox speaking about stuff like labor supply, about like don't work too hard, you're gonna take a job from your neighbor and stuff like that. So in doing all of this, I started to realize like, oh my God, I'm Irish. This is why like my whole life took place in Philadelphia in the 21st ward. Like this is why my grandfather ran for state assembly on the Democratic ticket. Like this is why there was a whole sort of Irishness to my upbringing that I never quite, it was just everybody around was Colleen McShana or whatever, you know, I mean, it's just like normal. So anyway, I started remembering that my grandfather used to always say when he was wanting to make fun of people who were sort of pretentious, he would always say, no self-respecting Shanti Irish would ever do such a thing, you know. And he was you know, he made it. He had 7 kids, and you know, a successful lawyer and stuff like that. But he was Shanti Irish through and through, and he always sort of raised all of us to self-identify as Shanti Irish. So I'm looking at all this hobo stuff, and one of the interesting sources on hobos and some of the cultural institutions that they made, including like the Hobo College in Chicago, which Jim Larkin, the strike leader, was part of founding. Like, it's incredible, these connections. It's so much fun, excuse me, to look at this. So there's a guy named Jim Tully, who I don't know anything about him, but he was a writer, a genius, fantastic writer, and hobo. He wrote a book called Beggars of Life that's sort of, like a lot of these hobos wrote memoirs, you know, and they'd be like, first I was in Oklahoma, and then I was in blah, 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 you know, and I haven't quite figured out exactly the right way to read them. I see nostalgia and I see certain things, but I like reading The Enemy better than I like reading Friends in a way, because I read against. I read like to resist
Very
what they're
important, yeah.
trying to say and see what are the voices like coming out on the margins of the text, you know, outside of that whole thing. So Jim Tully also wrote a book called Shanti Irish. It came up on my Amazon and I was like, Shanti Irish, what is this? It comes in the mail. And I open it up, and the page I happen to open to says, like, this is the desperation and whiskey-soaked story of the Lawler family. And that's my name, is Lawler. And so I'm looking at it, and I'm like, oh, my God. Like, I'm home.
But you like beer. You don't like whiskey
I'm
so
on the
much.
wagon. I'm on the wagon,
okay.
totally. But
Okay.
yes, I feel...
I'm just kidding. I know that I always had to get beer for meetings.
That's
Yes,
right, that's right. And now I'm actually going to start brewing my own this summer, non-alcoholic beer.
All right.
Because I
Fair
feel like
enough.
that's the wave of the future. And it's definitely the wave of my future,
Okay.
because I love
Okay.
beer. But as some of us, we got to stop drinking. It's a good idea. So anyway, yes, I never was a whiskey person. Only one time in my life I did try to cut down on drinking by drinking whiskey, because I figured
you don't like it, or
yeah, it was like
just
it burns, it goes down slow,
yeah,
and that lasted like 2 weeks
Right,
until then.
right,
I was like,
right.
this is great. I love the burn. So so yeah, whiskey, like all that stuff, is an acquired taste, and it's easy to acquire when you're.
Well, this is a very
Irish.
interesting project going
I'm
forward.
so
and
psyched.
We're
I'm having the
looking
time of
forward
my
to
life,
it,
yeah.
and of course we'll continue the discussion when the book is
Right on.
finished
Yeah.
and do it here. So maybe we should move. I just wanted to make one comment about the Left Forum. I mean, the interesting thing about the Left Forum this year is that the working triad in the beginning, you can correct me if I'm wrong, was Rage, Rebellion, Revolution,
Yes.
the new 3 R's,
Yeah, yeah.
right? And this was proposed to Slavoj Žižek as a talk, right, the triad.
Yeah.
And of course, he took it up in his
Which I thought,
exuberant
yeah,
way.
I thought
and
that
he
was
will-
pretty cool.
Yeah,
And he's giving the closing plenary.
Yes.
plenary on Sunday night, right before the show is
Yes.
aired, of course. And the thing that Žižek changed, though, was organizing our power
Yeah.
instead of revolution
Right.
for his talk. You know, he's going to work with that kind of triad. I mean, just maybe a remark about that, and then we'll move on to really the strategies of capital abandonment we're seeing.
You know, I don't know what to say about
Okay,
that
okay.
exactly. I thought it was pretty cool that, you know, somebody who's really well known doesn't always sort of take the theme that's written by
Right.
the people putting something together and say, like, okay, my talk is going to riff on this. So I'll be very interested to see what he
Okay,
says.
okay,
What do you think about
Well,
it?
I think that organizing our power is a step towards revolution.
Right, right.
We really need a form of
Yeah.
political organization. You know,
Right.
last week or 2 weeks ago, James Vretos and I did a show on Stanley's book, Left Turn, Forging a
Right.
New Political Future, and we talked about, you know, the question of organization.
Yeah.
And this seems to always be, you know, secondary to the upsurge, to the resistance, et cetera.
right,
How
right.
can we really do this?
Yeah.
So I'm very interested to hear this kind of practical, and it reminds me philosophically that Žižek is going to do something on Kant's second critique, which is practical reason,
Okay.
and how do you use this, and the word on Kant's critique of practical reason was that this was Robespierre put into practice. You know, so a kind of interesting take on that, how, you know, he sees this organizing power instead of just the revolution, the word. But
Right.
obviously there's enormous rage. And,
Yes.
out there, you know,
And
obviously.
you know, the
Yeah,
rage can
and-
go either
and
way,
about
as
the-
we see.
know very
Rage
well,
isn't always
and
like
we've had many
the good
programs
stuff. Yeah.
both on the right and left
Yeah.
populism, of which Peter will be speaking with you, I think, also.
Yes.
Well, I'm just
We'll
introducing it,
we'll-
but
yeah,
it's
yeah.
Peter,
Yeah.
Arun Gupta, and Bhaskar Sankara.
Right, we'll speak about right and left-wing populism, which is a very interesting
Huge.
topic.
I mean, that's
the
what we have to
topic,
talk
really, in
about
a
right
way,
now, right?
In a practical
That's it.
sense, yeah.
Yeah.
So moving on to capital abandonment, maybe we could start with a little bit of the interview with Dan. I think
Mm-hmm.
you prefaced it very well with the Studebaker plant being abandoned,
Yes.
and you know, all the way up to
Yeah.
the drum movement, and of course the flight of the auto industry south. You know, and I mean, I grew up in New Orleans. We knew about this, the new plants, Tennessee. You know, the Saturn
Yeah.
plant, of course, in the 70s and 80s, and right to work states, these kind of things, very little union presence there. And, New Orleans, even though there are some very militant organizations, never really had a huge labor movement as you had in the industrial cities. It was more of a kind of outgrowth of the plantation South and a kind of militancy against that, in which, the black radical class there was really still fighting, the Civil War, if you will, and a kind of overt racism all throughout the South. So, but today, as we know, we have plants in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, all throughout the South, Tennessee, obviously, et cetera. But so maybe we can talk about what this concept of capital abandonment about, and dialectically, since Kristin likes to read about the bosses, where's the capital influx? What is really going on in these reconstructions? And it seems to me that a city that you're from, like Baltimore, has been almost completely left behind in some ways in this deindustrialization and capital abandonment, and has been turned into a complex of mutual funds and Johns Hopkins University and nothing more.
Johns Hopkins now is the largest employer, of course, in the
Wow.
Baltimore area by far.
Wow.
Used to be Bethlehem Steel, which had a huge shipyard and steel mill, obviously. But I think Baltimore shows a number of dimensions of the problem of capital abandonment, because it's not simply that things move. It's not only that factories closed down, which happened, of course, in Detroit to more of a degree, but all the major industry in Baltimore also is more or less gone. The General Motors plant closed up and was torn down, Bethlehem Steel and all the rest. The shipyards, of course, are gone. The port is still very active, but it's with containerized shipping. So it's much less labor intensive than it had been, of course, in the 50s.
And this is very similar to New Orleans as well.
Very similar to New Orleans.
Which was the second largest port in the United States after New York, all the way up until the 60s.
So that's a common problem. But then you have a thing, and I think David Simon, who of course is the creator of The Wire, who many people know, the television show, he made a comment a few years ago about what really The Wire was about. And his comment was that that he wanted to explore what happens to people who have become superfluous to the economic, cultural, and political life of in that case, of course, Baltimore, but in the society. And it is not simply that jobs become scarce, or good jobs become scarce, or they move. And it's much easier to move the factory many times than it is to move the people and the families. It's also what kind of people you have produced. And you have people who were produced, who were educated or miseducated, inculcated with values that fit that kind of industry. So when the new businesses come into Baltimore, and if you go to around the port, it's very gentrified. Places like Fells Point, Camden is very gentrified. The kind of people who would have worked in the factories are not the kind of people who will now work in the kinds of businesses or the kinds of operations that come in. So they're completely without possibility. There's no hope, in essence. And there you have a real contradiction, in that more and more and more there is not a way to accommodate 10%, 15%, whatever percentage of the population in a meaningful way within the broader economy. So it is, even you move them to Tennessee or you move them to New Orleans, there's no solution in that way. So you have to go to solutions beyond capitalism, beyond the labor market. I saw this week Robert Reich, who is not the most radical of people, obviously, has come to the conclusion that a guaranteed income is inevitable. That the decline in the need for labor means that at some point you have to find a way of getting people ways of surviving and living that is not tied to work.
And cyclically, this is a discussion that began 40-something years ago when Richard Nixon was the president. So it's very interesting.
And the Democrats in the Congress did not support
this at that time. So it's good to keep this in mind as we go into a presidential election.
And I mean, talking about power politics, you would never get something like a guaranteed annual income unless there was something. I mean, I'm thinking about these, populations that become superfluous. There's always gotta be some relationship that you have with the system, right? There's always some point of contact. So even if it's just the refusal of social peace, if that's all you have to do something, right? I mean, you have to push them. Otherwise, they'll say, go ahead and starve, or we'll just lock you all up, or whatever. I mean,
that's what they do.
Yes. Yeah.
Well,
I mean, you
but
mentioned
people are talking about GAI.
in the documentary that preceded Detroit Do My Dying finally got the news. In the beginning, if you remember, John Watson gives a long talk about the history of black people in the United States and the importance of black people as those who work and labor in the United States. And he made the comment that some people say that because we're only 10% of the population or so, they may send us back to Africa, or they may just kill us or lock us up. But that can't happen, he says, because we are so vital to the American economy. Right. And if I remember well, he uses the phrase, you can't bite the hands that feeds you, meaning black people. Yeah. Now, in Baltimore, things have changed. It used to be the case, of course, that there were important people in that they were much of the labor pool of Baltimore. Now that's not the case. So you can bite the hand. You can lock them up at incredible rates of incarceration, where you have a 60+% probability that someone in the ghetto
That's insane,
will wind up in jail.
Yeah. So then, but there has to always be the question of where's your leverage, right? Where is your ability to push? So I'm thinking about the hobos. I'm thinking about everybody having left Detroit. Not everybody. There's still 700,000 and shrinking, but
used to be 2 million.
Right. So what do? Move? I mean, what do people?
I have an interesting comment on that vis-a-vis New Orleans. Just to go back to what Peter was saying, one thing about New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina that's very significant that has not really been addressed up to today is that over 125,000 people, mostly African American, have not returned to the city. And there's no documentation where they have ended up, and there's no real discussion. So basically, good 25% of the city, right, which was before Katrina 70% black, now is 50% for voting purposes. So there's obviously this political, cause that is happening here, right? And one person of the ruling class said, God gave us what we wanted. It was a racial cleansing. You can imagine this kind of vocabulary that played out. And these are people part of the reconstructive effort there. But in New Orleans, the Road Home program, right, which was billions of dollars that was given by the federal government, never really provided that way back for people. So you had this enormous psychic impoverishment. People like living in New Orleans, even if you're poor. It's a city where you can still live poor to a degree with some kind of dignity, if you will. I'm not saying that there's dignity in being poor, but at least you can survive, and there's a kind of culture around this, a musical culture, the jazz culture of the second line, et cetera. So this is a very, very important thing to remember, that, you had this much, in terms of Baltimore, right? They might say, bye to the jobs, right? In New Orleans, there were no jobs there at all, even before Katrina, much less afterwards. And you have these people that have been literally abandoned by capital. And at the same time, this kind of dynamic of capital influx that is creating in the bourgeois and a new kind of whiteification, if you will, blanchification of the uptown New Orleans' charm. It's tourism. What will bring people here? So what New Orleans has become is this kind of capital, if you will, of boutique capitalism and a third world residence in the United States. You basically can go live in the tropics with the charm of a European city for much less money than you can, you know, buying a place in Westchester County or in upstate New York, et cetera. So this is what this has become as a city. A city with very little industry, shipyards, right? Of course, there's a port town, you had some of that industry. Sugar, of course, the refineries, Domino Sugar was heavy there. But other than that, this is essentially now a tourist economy.
And there, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay, I was just going to say. And how does this going to play out ultimately with the new Detroit? You know, something that we, I think, need to examine, because Detroit has been, you know, colonized somewhat in the very downtrodden areas in the city. There's a great difference between Grosse Pointe and you know, downtown Detroit, by young people who are who are trying to squat or take, you know, what will happen to this as we go forward, and what are the possibilities? And I just wanted to add one other thing, and this is, you know, why I sort of interrupted. You know, in New Orleans after Katrina, thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of young people filtered through in terms of making an effort. The question to the left was, why wasn't squatting, just taking of spaces, you know, the possibility? You had so much devastation, why not just squat on these places, begin renovation, etc.? It didn't happen.
This is
and
America,
this is a question.
Michael.
I know it's America. He's playing with the wire here, right? The opening of the wire. You know the great sequence of the opening of the wire?
I never watched
You
The
never
Wire.
watched it. It's great. Yeah. You always have
I'm
to
not only
give
saying
another.
that. This country is built upon the sanctity of private property.
Yes, of course. Yeah. But, you know, if we're going to have, you know, today the subtitle is the possibility of a working class or an unemployed class, right? A sub-proletariat in some ways, class as an uprising or as a new form of historical agency. How does this happen?
I mean, unless it's property
possibility?
controlled by the Indians, who you can then exterminate and take, it's off the table. You know, if there's a deed, there's there are lawyers who can't just.
You mean
squat and take
alienation has a
property like that.
literal
Of course.
meaning, huh?
Also,
Without
yes,
meaning.
that's right.
Yes, I understand. Okay.
We would already have had won the fight of the war position of Gramsci says, of changing people's thinking to get them to the point where they would feel comfortable and think about, well, we're here, we're just going to take over the properties and use them.
It's like Marx's famous thing in Volume 1 of Capital, Chapter 6, freedom, equality, property, and Bentham. Yes.
Right.
So that's what we're fighting.
But
in a
also,
way.
if
kind
you
of
take
an inversion, you know,
Yeah.
of the French Revolution, freedom, liberty, equality, and fraternity.
But a lot of that respect for property, the American respect for property, is like a holdover. I mean, it goes way, way back, but I'm just thinking much more recently, in a way, from the extension of like mass home ownership after World War II to keep people from like a mass insurrection. I mean, that was part of the idea, was to give out property. So I do think there's hope. If you rob people from property, if you rob people of all property enough, little by little, people will stop respecting the idea
Or the
of private
possibility
property.
of not being able to have any property,
Yeah,
too,
sure.
which is
Then
another,
if it just
you know,
becomes
that
a
becomes-
pure
yeah.
abstraction and not, you know, something that is kind of real and does kind of, you know, ground you somewhere and in a certain set of values. If it's not there, you know, I'm thinking again of these hobos, but the absence of private property is both terrible in a lot of ways, you know, because it means you have nothing, but also, you know, I mean, I'm thinking about Greece too. Everybody was very into, all the Greeks, from what I understand, were super into property, right? And having these houses. And so no matter how much they cut the pensions and the wages, people sort of could live together in multi-generational kinds of situations. But then the state jacks up property taxes, and next thing you know, it's not your property anymore.
Well, there were no property taxes before.
There were no,
right,
yeah.
right. Yeah. And once they start happening, then you can't pay them. Guess what? It's not your property, you know? So it's...
They still cannot foreclose on your primary residence.
Oh, well, that's good. Yeah. I mean, that's something.
However, here in the not only do we have Hurricane Katrina going on, but here we had a crisis, a housing crisis, not seen since the 1930s, and still no real mobilization, out there. We had Occupy for a little while, but again, the question I think the radical imagination has to face is, why is this desire not for consistent upsurge, consistent resistance, consistent practice?
One of the things that Dan says in this interview about Black Mask and stuff, and that I think he might say in one of those ending chapters of the Detroit book too, is something that CLR James said, basically just to the idea is that it's only that things happen that are really surprising and that really surprise everybody. And it's only once it happens that then people look back and can see all of the building blocks, all of the things that made it happen. And I think there's something
So
sort
we're
of...
becoming Hegelian now. It's
Are we?
always the owl of Minerva, which will reflect on the day's activity, and then retrospectively will come to the understanding of the contingent. I'm sorry.
Yes, that's exactly what I meant to say, Michael. Thank you.
And in a certain way, it may be poetic justice that Detroit is destroyed the way it is, because, Detroit is the motor city. It's built on the automobile. It's built around, of course, the primacy of the automobile. And the automobile is what destroyed so many American cities. It destroyed,
indeed.
For a long time, of course, and still in some ways, the South Bronx, with a famous example of Robert Moses building the Cross Bronx Expressway. It destroyed cities like Baltimore and Cleveland and Pittsburgh and so forth, where the urban character of the city and Philadelphia, to a little bit lesser extent, was really eroded and destroyed, and it was they were suburbanized and people moved out.
That and the air conditioner.
Yeah.
That and the air
and
conditioner.
not just the automobile factories too.
Yes,
and like
absolutely.
fetishizing the factory and factory jobs made it so that Dan in our interview with Situation tells that story about Coleman Young, giving this great deal to GM to build some plant to, decimate all of Pole Town, which was a pretty integrated, pretty interesting working class neighborhood, it sounds like, make it into a parking lot for an auto plant that had ramps coming in straight from the suburbs. So I do think there's something about when we think about the manufacturing jobs and the jobs that aren't coming back, I'm interested in them being as organized and militant everywhere as possible. But it's not working in a factory. It sucks. The other thing that was going on at the time of all of this is like Lordstown and all of that. It's hell. And that's what they knew. That's what they were really fighting against was the hell of the factory, and also in a larger sense, the struggle over what technology was going to be used for, because they were these super high-tech plants and they used the technology and the automation to make the cars shittier and the work process more horrifying and nightmarish for everybody, rather than, and so I think there's other things about the use of like the internet technology and stuff like that we can learn from their struggles.
And we're happy to have the robots do the work.
Hell
correct?
yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Well, our group, at least why work? We're about this in a lot of ways.
Absolutely.
Do we really need to at this point?
Right.
Yes.
And that's the other thing I love about these Irish is I did not realize until I started looking into it, the lazy Irish. It was all about how lazy the Irish were.
So you have the slacker gene in you.
I think so, apparently. Rather than genetics, I've decided
Yes, I understand.
I prefer the cell as the model.
Oh, that's good. I like that.
Because cells sort of, they're permeable, but they do hold memories, and they can grow and change and mutate for good and bad. But I've been trying to think, there is a biological metaphor I like.
Revolutionary kind of
I think so.
synonymic,
Cell, totally.
yes,
I don't want to talk about genes, but I do have
I understand.
cellular
Unless
predispositions
J-E-A-N-S,
to.
right,
then every day, Yeah.
Good. So we're have about 2 minutes.
Okay.
Maybe we can try to wrap it up a little bit. We're going maybe talk about, is there a possibility of a new agency of these left behind people, or these people that have
Yeah.
been abandoned by capital, or these afflicted cities have the possibility of regenerating from some kind of internal base, or will this be external capital, dictating to them how it's going to be with high rises and,
Well, I think there's
insurance
no
companies.
evidence of a possibility of a
right,
new
right.
agency to counter the process. There's anger.
Yes, nothing
There is
but rage.
discontent. There are
Rage, yeah.
fundamental contradictions in terms of how the economy works, in terms of jobs and so forth. But there seems to not be a desire to break with the existing constitutive relations, social relations in the United States. Not only the United States.
Right.
Everyone, I mean, to some extent, from occupying the rest, people want to go back to what used to be. They want jobs, they want good living, good medical insurance, benefits, and the rest.
Okay. Kristin, would you like to add? We have about 30 seconds. I'm sorry, I have to play Amy Goodman here. You have 30 seconds left.
To wrap it up, I
Yes.
think there's hope. I think there's hope. I really do. I think one thing that we know is that when there's enough capital disinvestment, at a certain point, it hits a point, and then capital starts to come back in. Just that's how it works. That is what happens, for better or worse. There's always a certain kind of a possibility, I think, of radical action in cities.
I hope everybody will be at the Left Forum, or has been at the Left Forum.
See you there,
And
or
we will
did
see you there.
yeah.
Thank you very much. This has been another episode of The Radical Imagination. I thank Peter Bratsis, my co-host, and our special guest and future participant on this program, Kristin Lawler.
Right on.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, you guys.
Okay.